Hello, I think we're live. I want to welcome you to part two of our live stream concerts, the history of the piano, and the short history of the piano in several different parts. We'll probably have at least two or three more after this. I want to thank Sally Sparks and Streamside Music for making this new project, Keep Music Live project during the Corona age. It's so important to be able to play live music and to feel the sense of being in a community, even though we're not really together in person. It's wonderful to be able to connect to so many people online in so many different places. I know I have people in Buffalo. Hi, Mom. I hope you're watching. And of course, up in the New Hampshire, Vermont area where my Classicopia fans are. And then also maybe in Florida. I know I have some friends down there, and out in Santa Fe, and of course in Asheville and in Baltimore, where I run my Amici music series. And this is part of that series, and we hope you enjoy it. I hope you can check out amicimusic.org for all of our upcoming concerts that we will be doing, and also some wonderful videos of past concerts we have done, including one on Mother's Day, a beautiful musical Mother's Concert of women composers. And you'll hear a couple women today as well. So check out that page, and if you are so inclined, we'd love to get a donation to Amici Music to help keep music going. It's a tough time for musicians. We've lost a lot of gigs over the past couple months. Amici Music really aims to bring chamber music out to intimate places, and there's lots of musicians who unfortunately didn't get paid because of concerts, so any donations will go towards that, and a portion of the proceeds also to the Maryland Food Bank, which is doing wonderful work feeding the needy here in the Baltimore area. So thank you again for joining us. If you want to make a comment during the program, you can do so on your screen there, and I'll be trying to answer some as we go along. Those of you who were with us for our first part a couple weeks ago, you saw the music from the time of Bach, and we finished with this wonderful rendition of Chopin's Ballade, played live in Long Island by my 16-year-old nephew, Noah. Noah's not able to join us today. He's in the middle of taking 5 AP exams in the last couple of weeks, but he will hopefully join us again for another concert. But this one I'm going to do all by myself. And we're going to hear some wonderful music by Chopin. We're going to start with Chopin, and then we're going to do both Mendelssohns, Felix and Fanny this time, because I love the music of Fanny, and both Schumanns, Robert and Clara, who were both wonderful composers. And then we'll probably finish with Brahms. If there's time, I'll do some Liszt, but I have a feeling it's going to get to be too much, and so we'll start with Liszt on the next class. And we'll let you know when that next one is, the next concert, I should say, probably in the next 2 weeks at some point. So if you go on amicimusic.org, you will find that. Send me an email at daniel@amicimusic.org. Go on our email list so you can find out all this information, and also check out all the concerts here on Keep Music Live. She's doing all sorts of wonderful music, classical, folk, jazz, all kinds of things. So check it out over the next couple weeks. All right, so we are going to move, as I mentioned, as we did last week, from the classical period into the Romantic period. And we're going to really focus on the years 1830 to 1870, the heart of that great Romantic period. And again, classicism was all about the perfect structure and the architecture and the symmetry of everything. But Romanticism was all about the soul and all of that inner feelings that we have. As the great Goethe wrote, classicism is health, Romanticism is sickness. And in many ways, many of these romantic writers and composers and artists were rather sickly. Most of them died quite young. John Keats, I think, dies in his 20s, the poet, and Byron and Shelley in their early 30s. Chopin and Mendelssohn also die in their 30s, Schumann in his 40s. I always say that to be a great romantic composer, you either have to die young or get syphilis or end up in an insane asylum. And actually, Robert Schumann got the Triple Crown. He did all three of those, so we'll talk about that later. But many of these, really, they had short bursts of life, but what bursts they were. And again, the classical period, music was really just a luxury. Charles Burney, in his History of Music, said, this is from 1776, music is an innocent luxury, unnecessary indeed to our existence, but a great improvement and gratification of the sense of hearing. And Immanuel Kant, the great rationalist thinker, said, "In the judgment of reason, music has far less worth than any other of the beautiful arts." But once the Romantic period sort of finds its way in, and we talked about Beethoven being one of the first to unleash the soul, and this idea that music was actually the highest revelation of all. As Beethoven said, "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. It is the one incorporeal entrance into the higher world of knowledge which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend." And music became sort of the quintessential of the arts in the Romantic period. The poets all loved music. So if we look at John Keats, he said, "Let me have music dying, and I will seek no more delight." And Percy Bysshe Shelley, in a poem called Music, wrote this beautiful line, "I pant for music, which is divine. My heart in its thirst is a dying flower. Pour forth the sound like enchanted wine. Loosen the notes in a silver shower. Like a herbless plain for the gentle rain. I gasp, I faint, till they wake again." And the German philosophers as well, in the early part of the 19th century, Ludwig Tieck said, "Without music, earth is like a barren, incomplete house with the dwellers missing." And Wackenroder, another writer, said, "Music is the art of arts, for it is able to detach the sentiment of the human soul from the chaos of earthly existence." And Robert Schumann, who we're going to see, was much more of a writer about music than a composer during his life. He wasn't known really as a composer. He said, he followed the writer Jean Paul, who had once said, "Music is the moonlight in the gloomy night of life." And we're going to see a lot about nighttime music, nocturnes, as we call them. That comes up several times in today's concert, where it's all about the night and the spookiness and the mystery that exists in the night. And as Schumann said, he said, "I learned more counterpoint from Jean Paul, the writer, than from all my music teachers combined." And Schumann also had some wonderful aphorisms. He said, "The aesthetics of one art is that of the others too. Only the materials differ." The idea that all the arts could sort of merge together and connect in wonderful ways was really a very romantic idea. And finally, Schumann said, "Music speaks the most universal languages, one by which the soul is freely yet indefinably moved, but it is then at home." So let's now get to our first composer of the day, and that is the great Frederic Chopin. And Chopin, I mentioned, was born in 1810, would die in 1849 at the age of 39 years old. Probably the greatest pianist who ever lived in terms of sort of the poetry of the piano, and he really helped develop the piano as the instrument par excellence of the Romantic period. It was a pretty new toy, this piano. It was really developed in the early part of the 1800s, and not till Steinway makes the first pianos in the 1850s does it sort of reach its modern stage. So there were lots of new inventions going on, and especially we're going to hear how the pedal was used by Chopin as kind of the soul of the piano for overtones and harmonic ideas that really stretched what music could do. And Chopin got all those wonderful coloristic effects. He was a very sickly child, as I mentioned last time. Berlioz said about him, "Chopin was dying all his life." And he had tuberculosis and again died at 39. He was good friends with the artist Eugène Delacroix. And Delacroix said, "Chopin is the truest artist I have ever met." And one last quote before I get to my first piece. It was the great Oscar Wilde. I think I did this one last week, but it's such a great quote. Oscar Wilde said, "After playing Chopin, I feel as if I have been weeping over sins that I never committed and mourning over tragedies that were not my own." So what I'd like to do is start off, I'm going to play a few Chopin pieces, and I'm going to start with a very famous waltz of his, the Waltz in B minor, Opus 69, number 2, written in 1829. It's confusing and as a late opus number. This was not published in Chopin's lifetime. And in fact, he told Fontana, his friend, don't publish any pieces after I die. Luckily, Fontana did not listen to him, and several of the famous pieces that we know of Chopin, he published, and so they have these later opus numbers. But we know this piece was written in 1829, and it has that great mournful quality. Even though it's a waltz, it's a kind of sad waltz. I think you'll recognize it. Here's Chopin's Waltz in B minor. I hope you enjoyed that first Chopin piece, his Waltz in B minor. Now, Chopin was born in Poland and was quite a young prodigy composer, writing his first pieces when he was 7 years old. But he ended up making his way to Paris around 1830, right when the revolution started. The Polish rose up against the Russians, and Chopin, being so sickly, was going to be very little use as a fighter. So he heads off to Paris and really spends most of the rest of his life there in Paris, only making a few journeys back. While he's in Paris is when he writes so many of his famous works. We're going to do next his wonderful Nocturne in E flat, which was written about 1830 or 1831, Opus 9, number 2. And Chopin once said the following, and I think this really goes towards his music. He said, "Simplicity is the highest goal, achievable when you have overcome all difficulties. After one has played a vast quantity of notes and more notes, it is simplicity that emerges as the crowning reward of art." So he was always trying to find, even though there are a lot of notes, just that beautiful line that could come through. And you hear this so much in this next piece. He also said, "Bach is like an astronomer who, with the help of ciphers, finds the most wonderful stars. Beethoven embraced the universe with the power of his spirit. I do not climb so high. A long time ago, I decided that my universe would be the soul and heart of man. And one last quote that I want to read of Schumann about Chopin. It was Schumann who said that Chopin's music was like cannons hidden, disguised as flowers. And he said that they were very dangerous for all the autocrats out there, and they should listen carefully to his wonderful music. So here's one of these cannons that is so beautifully disguised, the Nocturne, Opus 9, number 2. So that's the very lovely Chopin Nocturne in E flat major, Opus 9, number 2. All right, now, let's see where I am here. Okay, so, when Chopin gets to Paris, Paris is kind of the center of the musical world at this point. There's all the great pianists and composers sort of are converging on Paris. There's a lot of great pianists there, virtuoso pianists who could do just about everything. Franz Liszt, we're going to see, comes there. As Chopin wrote, he said, "I don't know where there can be so many pianists as in Paris. So many asses and so many virtuosi." Sorry for any kids listening, but Chopin wrote that. And while he's in Paris, he does meet the wonderful Georges Sand. We'll talk about her in a second. But he starts to feel depression and not being able to be in Poland and helping the people there, but this sort of gnawing longing and suffering that all these romantics did. And he wrote about that. He said the following: "I am often gay on the outside, especially among my own folk. But inside, something gnaws at me, some presentiment, anxiety, dreams, or sleeplessness, melancholy, indifference, desire for life, and then the next instant, desire for death. Some kind of sweet peace, some kind of numbness, some absent-mindedness. Sometimes I can only groan, suffer, and pour out my despair at the piano." And that really is we're going to see this in so many, the melancholiness and the longing and the tortured life of these romantic composers. And I thought the perfect piece to play for that is his very famous fantasy Impromptu, Opus 66. This was another piece that he did not want published. And that's, again, it was the first piece that Fontana found and said, "I got to get this piece out there." And it's a good thing he did. It's one of his most famous, has this very tempestuous first part and last part, but in the middle is the wonderful, very slow tune that became "I'm Always Chasing Rainbows." That was a famous vaudeville song and appeared in the movie Irene, and you'll hear that. It was turned into that song, but Chopin came up with it first. So here is the Fantasy Impromptu, Opus 66. So that's one of Chopin's epic works. Again, not published in his lifetime. He didn't really want that music out there. I think he thought that it felt a little bit too close to the Moonlight Sonata. There's some connections there, but it's a great work and fun to play. All right, so we're going to do one last Chopin piece. I just want to fill you in on the rest of his life. During the around 1837, he meets a woman whose name is Aurore Dupin, better known to us as Georges Sand, an author who took the male name so that she could get her work published. And she wrote some good potboiler novels in the 1830s and 1840s. A lot of people were reading these kind of salacious, at times, books, lots of good stories in them. And it was a kind of a weird relationship because Georges Sand was very man-like. She would wear pants and smoke a cigar, and Chopin was under 100 pounds, and people talked how kind of effeminate he was. He would often faint in the middle of his concerts. It was just too much exertion for him to play. He didn't play with a lot of sound, so he could only play in these small house concerts. So people weren't sure who was the man and who was the woman in the relationship, as they sometimes said. But they actually stayed together for about 7 years, although when they first met, this is how Chopin wrote to a friend: "I have just met a great celebrity, Madame Dudevant, better known as Georges Sand. Her appearance is not to my liking. Indeed, there is something about her which positively repels me. What an unattractive person she is. Is she really even a woman? I'm inclined to doubt it." But somehow they ended up having a pretty good time together. I think she really became sort of a mother figure to him, his muse, at a time when he really needed somebody to mother him. Again, he was very sick all the time, as I mentioned, and in fact, they went on the honeymoon in 1838 and 1839 to Majorca, and that's where he wrote his wonderful preludes. I don't have time to play the Raindrop Prelude. I am hoping to do a whole class on Chopin, so if you love the music of Chopin, and who doesn't love the music of Chopin, come back and check it out in June. We'll be going to be doing this up in Classicopia online as our 20th anniversary. That's what we did 20 years ago. Our first salon was Chopin. And for the Amici music fans in Baltimore and Asheville, I'll be doing it in early July. So check out the Chopin classes, Zoom classes coming up. But while he's in Majorca, he says the following. He got very sick and was coughing up blood. He said, "The three most celebrated doctors on the island have just been to see me. One sniffed at what I spat, the second tapped where I spat from, and the third sounded at me and listened to me as I spat. The first said I was dying. The second said I was going to die any day. The third said I was already dead." It was a crazy time, but he survives through that. And then they actually have a few wonderful years. Georges Sand had a chateau called Nohant in central France, and that's where he did a lot of his composing in the summer, and then he'd go to Paris to teach in the fall and winter. But Georges Sand has a wonderful description of watching Chopin compose, and I want to read the whole thing now. She said the following: Chopin's music was spontaneous and miraculous. He found it without seeking it, without previous intimation of it. It came upon his piano suddenly, complete, sublime, or it sang in his head during a walk, and he was impatient to hear it himself with the help of the instrument. But then began the most desperate labor that I have ever witnessed. It was a succession of efforts, hesitations, and moments of impatience to recapture certain details of the theme that he could still hear in his head. What he had conceived as one piece, he then analyzed too much in trying to write it down. And his dismay at his inability to rediscover in what he thought was its original purity threw him into a kind of despair. He would lock himself in his room for whole days, weeping, pacing back and forth, breaking pens, repeating or changing one bar 100 times, writing and erasing it as many times, beginning again the next day with an infinite and desperate perseverance. He sometimes spent 6 weeks on one page, only in the end to write it exactly as he had sketched it the first draft. Isn't that always how it is? Sometimes we can analyze too much. But it was a torturous thing to compose for Chopin, trying to find the perfect way to write this. And I'm going to finish with one of the last pieces that he wrote in 1847, just a couple years before he dies. This is right after he breaks up with Georges Sand, and there is a sort of loneliness and melancholy in this piece. This is the very famous Chopin Waltz in C-sharp minor, opus 64, number 2. So here was the final waltz. If I can find it. So there's the wonderful Chopin Waltz in C-sharp minor, one of the last pieces that he would write. So we're going to leave Chopin for a little bit, but again, I hope you can join me later on, if you can, for some great Chopin, a full class of three or four classes. I'll get to play lots of his music and tell you more about his incredible life. But I want to move now to just a couple short pieces by Felix Mendelssohn. I played his Rondo Capriccioso last week, but I want to play a couple of his song without words. That's really what he was most famous for in his lifetime. He did several books of these with six pieces each, and because they're a little bit saccharine at times and sentimental, after he died, people sort of looked back at him and said, oh, he was kind of a mawkish writer, but there's so much beauty in these pieces. And he called them songs without words because he had an interesting idea. He said, people often complain that music is too ambiguous, that what they should think when they hear is so unclear, whereas everyone understands words. With me, it is exactly the opposite, not only with regard to an entire speech, but also with individual words. So he thought words were the ambiguous ones, but music just stated what was necessary and got right to the heart. Now, we do know that Chopin and Mendelssohn were pretty good friends. They were, of course, all of these guys, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schumann, they were alive at the same time. And they may not have been best buddies, but they respected each other. And we know that Chopin, when he was 18 years old, had traveled to Berlin to hear the young Mendelssohn play. But he was so starstruck, he didn't actually say anything to him. And then a few years later, Mendelssohn traveled to Paris to hear Chopin perform his first public recital there. And he found him to be the best of the virtuoso pianists in Paris. And in fact, supposedly Chopin composed a piece of music for Felix's wife, although that has not been published and the manuscript has vanished. So we don't exactly know what he did. But he did write a piano trio around this time that has a lot of Mendelssohnian aspects to it. And later in his life, he said, let me remind you that even if you do possess friends and admirers worthier and closer to you, none is more sincere than I. That was a letter sent from Chopin to Mendelssohn in 1845. So there was a sense of respect amongst them. Mendelssohn, I talked about, grew up in this wealthy family. His father was a banker, and I'll talk about his sister Fanny in a minute. There was a sense that Felix was going to be able to be the musician in the family. But Uncle Jacob, who was the mother's brother, thought he probably should be a banker. And he has a great quote I always like to say, which is so true. He said, "A professional musician, I can't get that into my head. That's neither a career nor a life, nor a goal. One is no further advanced at the end than one was at the beginning. In fact, one is generally better off at the beginning." So always the issues of trying to make money as a musician certainly came up. I mentioned that they were born Jewish, but they were converted because of a votum issued by the Prussian Ministry of Finance and other laws, which basically said it would be desirable not to have any Jews at all in the country. We must tolerate those we already have, but at the same time, we must constantly try to render them as inoffensive as possible. As long as a Jew remains Jewish, he cannot obtain a position in the state. So Mendelssohn became Christian, and he actually helped discover some of the great Christian music of Bach, the St. Matthew Passion, among others. He wrote some great oratorios. And when he died, as I mentioned, he was a very popular composer, probably second only to Beethoven when he dies in 1847. But soon after, a pamphlet appears called The Jews in Music. It's written anonymously at first, but we later know it's written by Richard Wagner, the composer of operas that last way too long. But he did not appreciate Jewish composers, and he actually singled out Mendelssohn. He said, "Mendelssohn has shown us that a Jew may possess the greatest abundance of talents, the finest and most diverse education, the most elevated, delicately perceptive sense of honor, yet in spite of all of these advantages, never once be able to summon the profound rending of heart and soul that we expect from music." Now, it's really hard to believe when you listen to Mendelssohn's music that you don't hear heart and soul in it. It is filled with that. Yes, there are some flourishes in his music, but I think Wagner was just a little perturbed that Mendelssohn didn't use some of his own music when he was a conductor in Leipzig. And ultimately, Mendelssohn would go on, along with Schumann as friends, they were very good friends in Leipzig, to help start the Leipzig Conservatory. And unfortunately, his statue was taken down in front of that conservatory during Hitler's reign. And there's a wonderful story I think I mentioned last time called Mendelssohn on the Roof, written by Yuri Weil, which takes that idea, and in the story, the SS officers go up on the top of the Prague Opera House and are told to take down the statue of Mendelssohn. But all the names of all the composers are up there, and all the names are kind of washed out from time, so they don't know which one is Mendelssohn. So they decide to take down the one with the largest nose, and that happens to be Wagner. So we got him back. But here's a little bit, two of his songs without words. We're going to do the Opus 67, number 1, written in 1843, and Opus 85, number 4, written in 1845. So that's a little of Felix Mendelssohn. And if you don't feel a little heart and soul in that music, then maybe you're missing a heart and a soul, I have to say. All right, now the next two composers I'm going to play are both women. I'm going to start with Fanny Mendelssohn and then move to Clara Schumann. I hope some of you were able to watch our Mother's Day concert where we did some wonderful piano trios with the Borowskis, Emmanuel and Francis, with our masks on here from my living room. And we live streamed that through the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. If you didn't get to see that concert, you want to hear some really beautiful music, go to amicimusic.org and check out our video page. I have that concert up. It's just beautiful, and it inspired me to look for some more solo piano music by these two women, because that's what they mostly wrote, because they didn't have an opportunity to do large-scale works. A woman's place was not in the world of composing. And I had written some wonderful quotes last time. If I can find them here, I will read them again. I've lost them all. But some ideas that women really are not able to write music. And they were, let me see, hold on one sec. I've got to find them. Oh, they've disappeared on me. Such good quotes. Anyways, let me talk about Fanny, and I'll find them later. Fanny was born in 1805, the granddaughter of Moses Mendelssohn, the wonderful philosopher. Again, her father Abraham was a wealthy banker. Mother Leah Solomon was also fairly wealthy and was a very good amateur pianist. They were both playing piano at a very early age. And in fact, when she was 13 years old, her present to her father was to play from memory all of the Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. And her mother always described her Bach fugue fingers. She had very long, bony fingers. Writes her first piece at the age of 14, would go on to write over 460 works altogether, most of which were not published and still aren't published. Rest in libraries and in dusky attics somewhere in Germany many times. She did get to study composition for a while with Karl Zelter, the director of the Berlin Sing Academy. But it was clear this was not going to be a profession. And her father writes to her when she's 15 years old, "Perhaps music will be Felix's profession, whereas for you it can and must be but an ornament and never the fundamental baseline of your existence and activity." And then in 1828, as she's in her early 20s, he said, "You must take yourself in hand and concentrate harder. You must school yourself more seriously and eagerly for your true profession, a young woman's only profession, and that is the state of being a housewife." So that was sort of the feeling. And unfortunately, Fanny does get married. She marries a wonderful painter by the name of William Hensel. So you sometimes see her name as Fanny Hensel. And Hensel really wanted her to compose. He would always put a blank manuscript paper on her music stand every morning and tell her he wanted it to see it filled up by the time the day was done. So he was one of the few in her life that was supporting her. There's a myth about how close Felix and Fanny were, and the fact that when Fanny dies in 1847, Mendelssohn dies less than 6 months later of a broken heart. They might have been close, but I don't think Felix quite understood the impulse to create that was within his sister, even though she made it pretty clear most of the time. She ends up having one son named Sebastian Ludwig Felix, named after her three favorite composers, Bach, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn. Father Abraham dies in 1836, and I think this is the time when Fanny thinks, okay, now I can publish. The father's not there to tell me not. I can get my music out there. And she even asks her mom to talk to Felix about it. And the mom writes a letter to Felix, and then the Felix writes this letter back in 1836. "From my knowledge of Fanny, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for composing. She is too much all that a woman ought to be for this. She regulates her house and neither thinks of the public, nor of the musical world, nor even of music at all, until her first duties are fulfilled. Publishing would only disturb her in these, and I cannot say that I approve of it." He had also written this horrible letter when she had her baby, and she had written to him saying that she was having writer's block because the baby was there crying and she couldn't focus. And he said, "You can hardly expect a man like me to wish you some musical ideas. It's just greediness for you to complain of a scarcity of them. If you wanted to, you would already be composing with might and main. And if you don't want to, why do you fret so? If I had a child to nurse, I would not want to write scores. Seriously, the child is not even half a year old, and you already want to think of ideas other than little Sebastian? Be happy that you have him. Music fails to appear only when it has no place. That is a seriously rude letter, and if I were Fanny, I would have phoned him up and said, you're a complete jerk. But this is not how they did things in the 19th century. But what Fanny did was find a few people who really liked her music, and one of them was a pianist named Karl Klingemann. And in 1836, she writes this heart-rending letter to him saying the following: I am enclosing 2 piano pieces which I have just written. I must add that it is a pleasure to find a public finally for my little pieces, for here I have none at all. My songs lie unheeded and unknown. If nobody ever offers an opinion or takes the slightest interest in one's productions, one loses in time not only all pleasure in them, but all power of judging their value and the wish to create more. I am thus more or less alone with my music, but my own delight in music and Hensel's sympathy, that's her husband, keep me awake, and I cannot help considering it a sign of talent that I do not give it up, though I can get nobody to take an interest in my efforts. Finally, in 1846, less than a year before she dies, she decides, I'm going to publish whether you like it or not. And she writes this rather interesting letter to Felix. She says the following: Dear Felix, I don't expect you to read this rubbish now, busy as you are, but I want to tell you something. Laugh at me or not, as you wish. In a word, I'm beginning to publish. I hope I won't disgrace all of you. I know you won't really mind. As you can see, I've proceeded completely on my own to spare you any unpleasant moments. And if it all goes to the bad, I can have no one to blame but myself. Please don't think too badly of me. So it's really depressing to read some of Fanny's writings, but what is not depressing is to play some of her beautiful music. I'm going to play 2 pieces. First, I want to play a little Allegretto Grazioso. Again, none of these are published. I can't even remember how I got this one. I think it was in a book at the Dartmouth Library, but it's such a beautiful piece. And I think it was written as a wedding present for Felix when he got married in 1836. That same time that he was telling his mother, Fanny's not really a composer. She sends him this incredible piece of music. I hope you enjoy it. It's called Allegretto Grazioso. magical little piece there, a gift to her brother, who didn't even seem to care that she was writing such glorious music. And I want to play one more, Fanny, that I only just discovered. And this is thanks to my cousin Janice down in the Villages there in Florida, who has taken up the piano again and is playing some wonderful music. And she had heard the Fanny Mendelssohn trio that I done and said, do you know this Nocturne? And she sent it to me a few days ago. It is a beautiful piece of music written in 1838, again, showing the power of this incredible composer who still is not well known enough. She wrote some wonderful cantatas that you can see on YouTube. And in fact, there's a great story of a piece she wrote called the Easter Sonata that was lost for many years. And most people thought it was a piece written by Felix Mendelssohn. And when they found the score to it at some point, it said F. Mendelssohn. So people just assumed it was by Felix. But a wonderful grad student, I think from the University of North Carolina, Angela Mace Christian, did some amazing sleuth work and discovered that it was a diary notice that Fanny had written talking about her own piece, the Easter Sonata, and she has convincingly said that this was definitely Fanny's music. Some still can't believe it because it's so powerful and masculine and Beethoven and Bach-like, but she was a real force of nature and sadly died way too young, right when she was just getting into the joy of composing. So here is her Nocturne from 1838. So, truly a remarkable composer, and as I mentioned, we're still finding these pieces, and they're just such a joy to hear so many great works written that are not in the repertoire, and it's all men's fault for not discovering these sooner. Again, if you'd like to make a donation to Amici Music, please look at our donate button there on amicimusic.org. I think I'm really going to only have time to just do the Schumanns now, and I'll save Brahms for the next class, because I always talk too much, but there's so many great stories. There is a wonderful quote from the pianist Amy Fay, who was a student of Liszt, and she said, "Women have been too much taken up with helping and encouraging men instead of placing a proper value on their own talent, which they are too prone to underestimate and to think not worth making the most of." And that really is so true of our next woman composer, Clara Wieck Schumann. Clara Wieck was one of the great pianists of her time, had started playing when she was 2 years old, could play before she could talk. She couldn't even talk until she was 6 years old. But her father, Frederic Wieck, was a really good piano teacher. And he instilled in his daughter not only the need to be able to play the notes, but to bring the poetry of the notes. He would take her on long walks, have her read poems, really get into that whole romantic spirit. And she played, when she played, people just cried to listen to her. So she had a magic about her playing. When she's about 11 years old, they happen to meet Robert Schumann, who happens to be a law student at the time. He would drop out of law school, hey, something I did too, to become a musician. But at the time he was studying law, he actually saw Clara play at a party, and he said, "I want to play like that." So he actually quits law school, I'll get to that in a second, and studies with Frederic Wieck. In fact, lives in the house with them. And much to the horror of the father, Clara begins to fall in love. They begin to fall in love, a great romance, even though she's only about 16 years old at the time. They have their first kiss in 1835, at which point Frederic takes Clara out on a long tour that lasts about 2 years, all over Europe, hoping she will forget about Robert. Instead, Robert writes some of the most beautiful music during that period of 1836 to 1838, longing for her, It doesn't quite work, and I'm going to read a little bit of that in a later. But what is sad about Clara is that she was composing as well, and composing when she was 15 and 16 years old, writing music that you will hear, which is astounding. And in her diary in 1838, she says, "I once believed that I had creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not wish to compose. There never was one able to do it. Am I intended to be the one? It would be arrogant to believe that. That was something with which my father tempted me in former days, but I soon gave up believing this. May Robert always create. That must make me happy." And then in a letter to Robert a year later, she said, "I have a peculiar aversion to showing you anything that I have composed. I am always ashamed of it. Women always betray themselves in their compositions." But she still kept composing, not often, but she would get to it every once in a while. And in 1853, she wrote this beautiful letter to her young new friend Brahms, who we'll talk about, I think, next week. She said, "When I am able to compose regularly, I feel really in my element. Quite a different feeling seems to come over me. I am much freer and lighter, and everything seems to me bright and cheerful. Music is, after all, a good piece of my life. And when it is wanting, I feel as if I have lost all physical and mental elasticity. There is nothing greater than the joy of composing something oneself and then listening to it." They ultimately do get married in 1840, and they would have 8 children, 7 which lived through infancy. And then Robert, who was probably bipolar or schizophrenic, tries to kill himself in 1854, spends the last 2 years of an insane asylum. And really, when he dies, she devotes the rest of her life to playing his music. His music was not very well known during his lifetime. It was sort of poo-pooed as crazy music. But she made it really powerful, brought it to the attention of so many people, so that Schumann became one of the great pantheons, composers in the pantheon. And Robert recognized Clara's greatness. He actually wrote in 1842, "Clara has just written a number of small pieces that show a musical and tender invention that she has never attained before. But to have so many children and a husband who is always living in the realms of imagination do not go well together with composition. She cannot work at it regularly, and I am often disturbed to think how many profound ideas are lost because she cannot work them out. But Clara herself knows that her main occupation is as a mother, and I believe she is happy in the circumstances and would not want them changed. So again, a husband, a man not quite understanding her wants. What's interesting is that Robert actually writes a review. He was a really good music writer. He writes a review of the two pieces of the Opus 6 that she writes, Soirees for piano. I'm going to do number 3, the Mazurka, and number 2, the Nocturne from it. But I just want to read a little bit about the review that he wrote about it because it's so poetic. He said, "The Soirees betray, plain for anyone to see, a life effulgent and tender, responsive to the slightest stirring. On one hand, a wealth of unconventional resources and ability to entangle the secret, more deeply twisting threads and then to unravel them, something one is accustomed to expect only from experienced artists and males." What do we have in these soirees? They tell us so much about music and how it surpasses the effusions of poetry, how one can be happy in pain and sad when happy. They belong to those who can delight in music without the piano, whose hearts swell to the bursting point at the sound of intimate yearning and inner song. Are they finally a result? Yes, in the way that a bud is a result before it breaks out in the splendid colors of the blossoms, fascinating and important as is everything that harbors a great future. And then, of course, to hear them as she plays them, one hardly knows what has struck him or imagines how such a thing can be recorded in symbols and written out. This is an astonishing art, and it is all hers. So that's a pretty good review, even if it is coming from your boyfriend, but it was, he recognized how beautiful she could write. So I wanted to play these two pieces. First, this Mazurka. We know that Chopin visited the Wieck family in 1835, right when she was writing these, and he probably played some of his mazurkas. He wanted to hear Clara play because he had heard about her, and he actually said she was the only one only woman allowed to play his music. She loved the way that she played his music, and she made Chopin a big part of her recitals. But she was inspired by Chopin. You'll hear this in the Mazurka, and then in the Nocturne, you're going to hear how she quotes a piece by Schumann, Schumann's famous Fantasy, which goes like this. Those are the famous dropping notes of his Fantasy. Clara quotes that as a sort of love through music. You'll hear that in the opening notes of her Nocturne. So first the Mazurka, and then her beautiful Nocturne. These are Opus 6, number 3, and number 2. Truly a special piece, and some of the harmonies that she gets in that work as a 16-year-old girl are so far advanced, and it's just so sad, sorry, to think about her not being able to get that voice out. All right, I'm just going to play the last work by Robert Schumann, and then we'll call it a night. I want to thank you for being a part of this. I want to thank Sally Sparks and the Keep Live Music Project for making this happen, and we'll get set up for the next one where we will get to do some Brahms and Liszt and Grieg, and probably get to some of the Russian composers, and that will be within the next couple weeks. I'll get a date out there, and again, if you check amicimusic.org, we'll get that up pretty shortly. And if you are so inclined, send a donation to Amici Music so we can help some of the musicians in this area and in the Asheville area, and also send some money to the Maryland Food Bank. Oh, I'm supposed to be looking over there. Hello. Now, Robert Schumann is one of my favorite composers because he is a law school dropout like myself. I have this wonderful letter. This is for you, Mom. He writes to his mother in 1830. He said, "My whole life has been a struggle between poetry and prose, or if you like, music and the law. Now I am standing at the crossroads and scared about which way to go. My genius points towards art, which is, I'm inclined to think, the right path. But the fact is, now don't be angry with what I say, it always seemed to me as if you were putting obstacles in my way." My mom never did that, so that's not true. "You had very good reasons for doing so, and I understand them all perfectly. And we both agreed to call art an uncertain future and a doubtful way of earning one's bread. There can certainly be no greater misery than to look forward to a hopeless, miserable existence which one has prepared for oneself. But I am still at the height of youth and imagination, with plenty of ability to cultivate and ennoble art, and have come to the conclusion that with patience and perseverance and a good teacher, I should in 6 years be as good as any pianist out there. Now comes the question, to be or not to be, for you can only do one thing well in this life, and I am always saying to myself, make up your mind to do one thing well, and with patience and perseverance, you are bound to achieve something. This battle against myself is raging more fiercely than ever, my dear mother. Sometimes I am bold and confident in my own strength and power, but at other times I tremble to think of the long way I have come and of the endless road which stretches before me." But he does decide to leave law school, study with Wieck, become a pretty good pianist, but actually destroys his piano career by trying to stretch out some tendons in one of his fingers and kind of rips him up. But it's probably better he didn't become a good pianist, because that's what Clara did well. Robert really went into composing, and unfortunately squelched Clara a little bit with that, by her own admission. But what I'm going to play next, I forgot when Wieck tears them away, Robert sort of tries to figure out a way to get back in good graces. I mean, Wieck was his teacher, and he figures that maybe he'll go and tell him that they're going to get married. It's not just some little fling, that they really want to be together, but apparently things don't go well. He writes to to Clara in 1838, "My interview with your father was terrible. He was frigid, hostile, and confused and contradictory all at once. Truly his method of stabbing is original, for he drives in the hilt as well as the blade. Do all you can to find a way out of his clutches. I will follow like a child. How my poor head swims. I could laugh from anguish. This cannot continue much longer. My health won't bear it. God keep me from despair." And they do eventually get together, although they have to go to courts in order to do it, because she's under 21, and Wieck refuses and calls Schumann a sort of worthless slob who's going to never make money in life, which is what happened, actually. But Schumann actually mostly wrote criticism. He did write some things. He had some great quotes. He said, "I should like to sing myself to death like a nightingale." And then he also says, "For me, music is always the only language which permits one to converse with the beyond." And so I'm going to finish today with some beautiful little pieces, sections of the Kindersehnen, or children's songs, that he writes in 1838 while Clara is being dragged away on tour. And he sends her these pieces, and this is what he writes when he sends it. "I've found nothing sharpens the imagination as much as expecting and longing for something. And this is how I have been the last few days. I have been waiting for your letter, And as a result, I have written books full of pieces, amazing, crazy, sober stuff. You'll stretch your eyes when you open it up. In fact, I sometimes feel as if I'm simply bursting with music. But before I forget, let me tell you what else I've written. Whether it was an echo of something you once said to me, that sometimes I seem to you like a child. At any rate, I suddenly got inspired, and I knocked off about 30 of these little pieces, from which I have chosen 12. They'll amuse you, but of course you must forget you're a performer. They all explain themselves, and as well as that, they're as easy as you can imagine. And even though they're children's pieces, they're not perfectly meant for children. They are so poetic in what they do. I'm going to just do the first 7 of these pieces. The 7th is the most famous of all, the Träumerei, or Dreaming, which sort of became the anthem of lots of things. And I forgot to mention, anybody who's interested, there's a wonderful book called Longing by J.D. Landis, which sort of is very well researched, but it brings the story of this Clara and Robert to life and has all sorts of these other characters involved as well. Mendelssohn and Chopin make little entrances in there. It's a thick book, but since you got all sorts of time stuck at home, check out Longing by J.D. Landis. Also some great movies about Chopin. There's Impromptu. Where are you? This is kind of a silly movie, but with some great acting. Judy Grant, as George Sand, and Max von Sydow as Liszt. Mandy Patinkin is in there. Hugh Grant as Chopin. He's actually pretty good, even though I don't usually like his acting. And then if you want to read a little bit about the Schumanns, or see the Schumann Spring Symphony, it's in German, but wonderful piece with Nastasia Kinski as Clara, and sort of this trials of how they had to fall in love with the crazy father standing in the way. So here are these first 6 pieces. The first one is called Of Strange Lands and People. They're all short little pieces. Then comes A Curious Story. Then Blind Man's Bluff. Then Pleading Child. Then Happy Enough. Then An Important Event with these big chords. And we'll finally finish with number 7. There are 13 altogether in the set, but Träumerei is the last one. So here's some pieces by Robert Schumann again. Thanks for being with us. And send me an email if you have any more questions, daniel@amicimusic.org. Thanks to Sally and Streamside Music for making this possible. Here's some music of Robert Schumann. Thank you again. Seems like the perfect piece to end on, the dreaming, the longing that was this romantic period. Sort of lots of unfulfilled ideas, but just so much beauty in that music. And we'll have more of it coming up in our next session. Again, we'll start off with some Brahms, and we'll hear some wonderful Grieg and Liszt, and probably Tchaikovsky. Please feel free to send some emails to me. Let me know what you thought. I hope the quality came out a little better than the first time. We worked a little bit on the mics, and I thank Sally for working that out. And I really appreciate you all being with me, sharing live music together in a time when we really need it. So have a great, great weekend, and love to see you at the next one. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.